Nobody dared to save this dying puppy, except for one man. On a cold, empty road, everyone drove past a broken, shivering animal left to die. But when one quiet stranger pulls over, everything changes. What starts as a simple rescue becomes something no one saw coming, because this puppy wasn't just abandoned, he was discarded, and someone powerful wanted him gone. As dark secrets claw their way into the light, this man finds himself in the crosshairs of a danger much bigger than he imagined. Why would saving a single puppy put his life at risk? And what will he uncover when he refuses to walk away again? You being here is a reminder. The quiet acts of love and kindness still matter. If you hold space for compassion, you're already part of this community. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty country road as Darrell Boone guided his weathered pickup truck around another bend. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel, his mind already on the quiet evening ahead in his workshop. That's when he saw it, a slight movement in the roadside ditch, barely visible in the fading light. Something made him slow down. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was that old memory scratching at the back of his mind. He pulled over, gravel crunching under his tires. The moment his boots hit the ground, he heard a weak whimper. His heart clenched as he approached the ditch. There, lying in the muddy water, was a German Shepherd puppy. Its brown and black fur was matted with dirt, and its small body trembled with each shallow breath. "Oh no," Darrell whispered, his deep voice cracking. "Not again." The sight hit him like a physical blow, sending him back 40 years to another day, another dog. He had been just 8 years old, watching helplessly as the neighbor's dog suffered behind their fence, too scared to tell anyone what he saw. By the time he finally worked up the courage to speak up, it was too late. The puppy's eyes, barely open, looked up at him. They held the same desperate plea he remembered from all those years ago. But this time, Darrell wasn't a helpless child. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his work jacket and gently wrapped it around the trembling pup. "Hang in there, little one," he murmured, cradling the small body against his chest. The puppy felt so fragile, like it might break at the slightest wrong move. Darrell's mind raced as he carefully placed the bundle on the passenger seat. The main vet clinic in town would be closed by now. It was past 6 o'clock. Then he remembered the new place that had opened on the edge of town, the one that advertised extended hours. He drove faster than he should have, one hand resting on the jacket-wrapped puppy to keep it steady. Every whimper from his passenger made his foot press harder on the accelerator. The lights of the clinic were still on when he pulled into the parking lot. Darrell gathered the puppy in his arms and burst through the front door, startling the young receptionist. "Please," he said, his voice rough with urgency. "This puppy needs help." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. A vet tech appeared, then the veterinarian herself, a woman with kind eyes and efficient movements. They whisked the puppy away to the examination room, allowing Darrell to follow. "It doesn't look good," the vet said frankly, examining the puppy under bright lights. "There's severe dehydration, possible internal injuries. The poor thing's been badly beaten." Darrell's hands clenched into fists. He knew what that meant. This was no accident. Someone had done this deliberately. "Whatever it costs," he said firmly. "Do everything you can." The vet looked at him carefully. "Sir, I should warn you. The treatment could be expensive, and even then—" "Money's not the problem," Darrell cut in. "Just save it, please." As the vet team worked, Darrell paced the waiting room. His own reflection in the window caught his attention. A broad-shouldered man with graying stubble and tired eyes. People in town knew him only as the quiet mechanic who kept to himself, the one who ran the small auto shop just past the town limits. They didn't know about his past, about the violence that had landed him in prison as a young man. They didn't know how he'd rebuilt his life piece by piece, choosing solitude as a way to keep the darkness at bay. His small house behind the workshop was enough for him, or so he'd thought. But now, watching through the examination room window as the vet worked to save the puppy's life, Darrell felt something shift inside him. The walls he'd built around himself seemed to crack, just a little. A tech emerged from the room, heading for supplies. "How is it?" Daryl asked, his voice hoarse. "Dr. Martinez is doing everything she can," the tech replied gently. "We'll know more soon." Daryl nodded and resumed his pacing. The waiting room clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking each moment that could mean the difference between life and death for the small creature he'd found in that ditch. He couldn't fail again, not like he had 40 years ago. This time he'd done something, but would it be enough? The memory of that childhood failure had shaped his entire life, leading him down a path of isolation and regret. Now, watching the medical team fight for this puppy's life, Daryl realized just how tired he was of being alone, of keeping the world at arm's length. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Daryl settled into one of the hard plastic chairs in the waiting room. His eyes stayed fixed on the examination room door, watching the shadows of movement behind the frosted glass. The puppy had to make it. It just had to. Heavy boots squeaked against the linoleum floor, drawing his attention. A deputy stood in the doorway, his uniform crisp and his face set in hard lines. Daryl recognized him as Deputy Morris, though they'd never spoken before. "Mr. Boone," the deputy said, his voice carrying an edge that made Daryl sit up straighter. "Heard you brought in a dog." "That's right." Daryl kept his voice neutral, careful. Years of experience had taught him how to handle authority figures. The deputy moved closer, thumbs hooked in his belt. "That puppy isn't yours to save, Mr. Boone. Best thing would be to let this one go." The words made no sense, but the threat behind them was clear as day. Daryl felt his jaw tighten. The puppy was dying in a ditch. What was I supposed to do? Leave it there? Sometimes that's exactly what you do. Deputy Morris's eyes were cold. Some things aren't meant to be messed with. Before Daryl could respond, the deputy turned and walked out, leaving behind a chill that had nothing to do with the clinic's air conditioning. Dr. Martinez emerged from the examination room shortly after, her face drawn with concern. She glanced around the waiting room before approaching Daryl, her steps measured and careful. "The puppy is stabilized," she said in a low voice, sitting beside him. "But there's something you should know." She paused, checking again that they were alone. "We found a microchip. The puppy belongs to Wallace Finch." The name hit Daryl like a punch to the gut. Everyone in the county knew Wallace Finch, the wealthy dog breeder whose kennels produced some of the finest hunting dogs in the state. His name was on half the charity events in town, his face always in the local paper, shaking hands with politicians and police chiefs. Wallace Finch? Daryl frowned. Why would someone like him dump a valuable puppy in a ditch? Dr. Martinez's eyes darted to the door. "Listen, Mr. Boone, I've heard things. Nothing I can prove, but—" She lowered her voice even further. "Just be careful. That's all I can say." Daryl nodded slowly, understanding the warning for what it was. The vet gave his arm a quick squeeze before standing up and returning to her work, leaving him alone with his thoughts. When he finally left the clinic, the puppy stable, but still critical, the night had settled in thick and dark. He climbed into his truck and started the long drive back to town, his mind churning with questions. The headlights of another vehicle appeared in his rearview mirror, staying with him, turn after turn. A squad car. Daryl's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The police cruiser followed him for 3 miles before finally turning off. But the message was received loud and clear. He was being watched. Back at his workshop, Daryl couldn't settle. He paced between the tool benches, pieces of the puzzle refusing to fit together. Wallace Finch was practically town royalty. His kennel supplied hunting dogs to half the state's elite. His donations kept the local police department well equipped, the mayor's office renovated, the town festivals running smooth. But there had always been whispers. Daryl had heard them in the gas station, in the diner, in the auto parts store. Stories about dogs disappearing, about strange noises from Finch's property late at night, about people who asked too many questions, suddenly finding themselves in trouble with the law. Daryl grabbed his laptop, a rarely used tool that mostly collected dust, and started searching. Wallace Finch's public image was spotless. News articles praised his contributions to the community. Photos showed him grinning beside gleaming trophies, his champion dogs posed perfectly beside him. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. A knock at his workshop door made him jump. It was just Carl from the parts shop dropping off a late delivery. But Daryl's heart took a while to settle back to normal. The deputy's warning echoed in his mind. That puppy isn't yours to save. But why? What could be so important about one German Shepherd puppy that it would bring a deputy out to deliver threats? What was Wallace Finch hiding behind that polished public image? Daryl walked to his office window, looking out at the dark road beyond. Somewhere out there, powerful forces were already moving against him, all because he'd stopped to help a dying puppy. He should back off. That would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But the memory of those pleading eyes in the ditch wouldn't let him. Not this time. Not again. The next morning, Daryl's old pickup truck rumbled down the same stretch of road where he'd found the puppy. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows across the ditches. He pulled over at the spot, marked by the fresh tire tracks his truck had left in the mud the day before. The morning dew hadn't quite burned off as Daryl climbed down into the ditch. His work boots sank slightly in the soft earth as he looked around. Something white caught his eye, a bundle of rags partially hidden under some weeds. His stomach turned as he got closer. The rags were stained dark brown with dried blood. "This wasn't an accident," he muttered, carefully picking up one of the rags with a stick. It was a shop towel, the kind mechanics used. But these weren't engine stains. These were deliberately used to clean up something else, something worse. Tire tracks in the mud told their own story. They weren't random or swerving like you'd expect from someone trying to avoid hitting an animal. These were straight, deliberate. Someone had stopped here on purpose. Daryl took pictures with his phone, careful to include the bloody rags and tire patterns. His hands were steady, but his heart was pounding. This was evidence of something ugly. Before heading to work, he drove past Wallace Finch's property. He'd passed it hundreds of times before, but had never really looked. Now he studied it with new eyes. The main house sat far back from the road, all brick and columns, trying too hard to look like an old plantation home. But it was the kennels that caught his attention. They stretched out behind the house in long rows, far bigger than any private breeder would need. The high fences and security cameras seemed excessive for a place that just raised hunting dogs. Daryl pulled over, pretending to check his phone while he counted. At least 20 large kennel buildings, each one big enough to hold dozens of dogs. But something was off. He could only hear a few barks, nothing like what you'd expect from a legitimate breeding operation. Back at his shop, between oil changes and brake jobs, Daryl made a call to animal control. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered. "County Animal Control, this is Sharon." "Hi, I wanted to report some concerns about a local breeding operation," Daryl said, keeping his voice casual. "Wallace Finch's place?" The line went quiet for a moment. When Sharon spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming formal and distant. "Mr. Finch's facility is regularly inspected and meets all county requirements. Is there a specific complaint you'd like to file?" "Well, I noticed the size of the operation seems—" "Sir," she cut him off, "Mr. Finch runs a licensed facility that's fully compliant with all regulations. Unless you have direct evidence of violations, there's nothing we can do." The phone clicked dead before he could respond. Daryl stared at his phone. That wasn't just a dismissal, it was a shutdown. Someone had clearly given instructions about handling questions about Finch's operation. That evening, he drove to the vet clinic to check on the puppy. Dr. Martinez met him with a tired smile. "He's doing better," she said, leading him to the recovery area. "Still weak, but he's fighting." The puppy lay curled on a blanket, hooked up to an IV. His eyes opened when Daryl approached, and his tail gave a feeble wag. Something in Daryl's chest tightened. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, kneeling beside the cage. The puppy's coat was a rich reddish-brown color, visible now that they'd cleaned him up. "You look like a Rusty to me. What do you think of that name?" The puppy's tail wagged again, stronger this time. "Rusty it is, then." Dr. Martinez watched from the doorway. "He's responding well to you. That's a good sign." Darryl reached through the cage bars, letting Rusty sniff his fingers. The puppy gave them a gentle lick. "How long until he can leave?" "A few more days at least. He's still fighting infection." She paused. "Have you thought about what you'll do with him once he's released?" Darryl hadn't planned that far ahead, but looking at those trusting eyes, he knew there was only one answer. "He's coming home with me." "Even with everything that's happening? The deputy's warning?" "Especially because of that." Darryl scratched behind Rusty's ears, earning another tail wag. "Something's wrong at Finch's place. The kennels are too big. Animal control won't even discuss it. And now this little guy shows up half dead in a ditch." He shook his head. "It doesn't add up." "Be careful, Darryl," Dr. Martinez warned. "Wallace Finch has friends in high places." "I know." Darryl stood up slowly, his mind made up. "But somebody dumped this puppy to die. Somebody hurt him on purpose. And I'm going to find out why." Rusty whined softly, pressing his nose against the cage bars. Darryl gave him one last gentle pat. "Don't worry, buddy. I'll be back tomorrow. You just focus on getting stronger." As he drove home that night, Darryl couldn't shake the feeling that he was stumbling into something much bigger and darker than a simple case of animal abuse. The oversized kennels, the suspicious officials, the threatening deputy, it all pointed to something systematic, something organized. The question was, how deep did it go, and what would it cost him to find out? The sharp crunch of broken glass under Darryl's boots echoed in the early morning darkness. He stood in front of his shop, his breath visible in the cold air, taking in the destruction. Someone had done a thorough job during the night. Every window was shattered, creating a carpet of glittering shards across the concrete floor. The shop's heavy metal doors were dented and spray-painted with bright red letters that screamed, "Back off," in dripping, angry strokes. Walking around the building, he found all the tires on his customers' cars had been slashed. The damage would cost thousands to repair. His insurance wouldn't cover half of it, assuming they believed his story at all. Darryl pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the emergency numbers. But what would he say? That he was being threatened for saving a dying dog? That the local big shot was running illegal dog fights? He knew how that conversation would go, the same way the animal control call had gone. He put the phone away and started sweeping up glass instead. Later that morning, he drove to the vet clinic to check on Rusty. The young vet tech who'd helped save the puppy that first night, Sarah was her name, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, an older woman he didn't recognize was manning the front desk. "Where's Sarah?" Darryl asked Dr. Martinez when she came to update him on Rusty's progress. The vet's face tightened. "She was let go yesterday. No explanation, just gone." She lowered her voice. "It wasn't right. Sarah was one of our best." Darryl's jaw clenched. Another warning. Another person's life disrupted because he wouldn't look the other way. As he was leaving the clinic, a young woman in muddy work boots approached him in the parking lot. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before speaking. "Are you the one who found that shepherd puppy?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Darryl nodded, studying her carefully. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "I'm Jess. I worked at Finch's place until yesterday." She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold something in. "I can't do it anymore. Those poor animals." "Let's talk somewhere else," Darryl said quietly, noticing a police cruiser rolling slowly past the clinic. They drove to a small diner on the edge of town. Jess ordered coffee, but didn't drink it, her hands shaking as she spoke. "That puppy you found, Rusty? He was supposed to be a champion fighter. Finch has this whole operation, underground fighting rings all across the state. They start training them young, making them mean." Tears welled in her eyes. But Rusty wouldn't fight. He just wouldn't do it. They threw him in anyway against this huge pit bull. It was horrible. Daryl's stomach turned as she described the brutal match, how they dumped Rusty's broken body in the ditch afterward, assuming he would die there, how it wasn't the first time and wouldn't be the last. Finch has everybody important in his pocket, Jess continued. Police, judges, even state inspectors. Nobody touches him. I tried reporting it once, anonymously. The next day, my supervisor reminded me about my little sister's college scholarship, the one Finch's foundation provides. You need protection, Daryl said. I know people who can help. Let me make some calls. Jess shook her head. I shouldn't have said anything. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. Not after seeing that puppy fight. She stood up suddenly. I have to go. Please, be careful. Finch doesn't just hurt dogs. Before Daryl could stop her, she hurried out of the diner. He tried following, but by the time he got to the parking lot, she was gone. The next morning, Daryl drove past the small apartment complex where Jess had told him she lived. Her car was gone. A neighbor walking his dog said she'd moved out in the middle of the night, just packed up and disappeared without a word to anyone. Daryl sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. First Sarah at the vet clinic, now Jess. People's lives were being upended because he'd chosen to save one dying puppy, because he'd started asking questions about things powerful men wanted, kept quiet. The message was clear. Back off. Or worse, things would happen. But as Daryl drove to his vandalized shop to start another day of repairs, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Not like he had when he was younger, when fear had made him turn his back on another suffering animal. This wasn't just about Rusty anymore. It was about every dog in those kennels, every person being threatened into silence. Someone had to stand up to Wallace Finch, no matter the cost. The morning after Jess disappeared, Daryl was sweeping up the last of the broken glass when a silver Honda pulled into his shop's parking lot. A woman stepped out, her boots crunching on the scattered pieces of window pane. She held up a small notebook, and Daryl's shoulders tensed. Another reporter looking for a quick story about small-town vandalism. Daryl Boone, she called out. I'm Valerie Monroe from the County Herald. Not interested in publicity, he said, turning back to his sweeping. What about justice? Her voice was sharp, determined. I know about the puppy you saved, and the vet tech who got fired. And now this. She gestured at the spray-painted warning still visible on his wall. This isn't random vandalism, is it? Daryl leaned his broom against the wall and studied her. She wasn't what he expected. No fake smile or rehearsed sympathy. Just intense hazel eyes and a no-nonsense stance that suggested she wouldn't be easily dismissed. Look, Ms. Monroe. Valerie, she corrected. And before you tell me to mind my own business, you should know I've been tracking Wallace Finch's activities for months. Something's not right with his operation, but every lead I follow hits a dead end. People clam up. Records disappear. Sound familiar? Daryl hesitated. After Jess's disappearance, he knew he needed help. But trusting a reporter felt dangerous for both of them. Why do you care? He asked. This isn't exactly front-page material. A bitter smile crossed Valerie's face. You mean why is a former national investigative reporter covering small-town news? She pulled out her phone, showing him an old article with her byline. 3 years ago, I exposed the senator's connection to a human trafficking ring. Had solid evidence, multiple sources, but he had powerful friends. Next thing I knew, I was blacklisted from every major publication. Now I write about county fairs and lost cats. Her honesty caught him off guard. He recognized something in her eyes, the same frustration he felt every time he hit another wall in this investigation. Come with me, he said finally. There's someone you should meet. They drove to the vet clinic where Rusty was recovering. The puppy's tail wagged weakly when he saw Daryl, his one good paw stretching toward him through the cage bars. This is what they were willing to throw away, Daryl said quietly, scratching behind Rusty's ears. Because he wouldn't fight. Valerie knelt beside the cage, her professional demeanor softening as she took in the puppy's condition. "Tell me everything," she said. Over the next hour, Daryl shared what he'd learned: the suspicious kennels, the vanished whistleblower, the police warning. Valerie took detailed notes, occasionally interrupting with sharp questions that revealed her investigative instincts. "We need proof," she said finally. "Hard evidence that can't be buried or explained away. I have some contacts in the State Gaming Commission. They take dogfighting very seriously. But we need more than rumors." "I've been gathering things," Daryl admitted. He pulled out his phone, showing her photos he'd taken of the ditch where he'd found Rusty, including the blood-stained rags and distinctive tire tracks. "And I found these behind Finch's compound." He produced crumpled supply receipts for unusual quantities of medical supplies and fighting equipment, carefully collected from overflowing dumpsters. Valerie's eyes lit up. "This is a start. I can run the tire treads against Finch's vehicle fleet. And these supply orders, they're way too large for a legitimate breeding operation." She pulled out her own phone, showing Daryl shaky footage someone had sent her anonymously. Distant shots of vehicles arriving at Finch's compound late at night, carrying crated dogs. "Together, we might have enough to build a case," she said. "But we'll need to be careful. If Finch realizes we're working together—" "I know the risk," Daryl interrupted, "but I made a promise." He looked at Rusty, who had fallen asleep with his paw still stretched toward them. "I'm not walking away this time." Valerie studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Neither am I. Sometimes the stories that seem smallest turn out to be the most important." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning their investigation, sharing contacts and comparing notes. As they talked, Daryl felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just for bringing down Finch's operation, but for making things right. For redemption. When Valerie left that evening, they had a strategy. She would work her official channels while he gathered evidence from the ground. It was dangerous, but with each of them watching the others back, they had a chance. Daryl stayed late at the clinic, keeping Rusty company. The puppy's breathing was stronger now, his wounds slowly healing. Looking at him, Daryl knew he'd made the right choice, both in saving Rusty and in trusting Valerie. Sometimes, he realized, you had to risk everything to save something worth saving. Over the next 2 weeks, Daryl and Valerie's investigation gained momentum. They worked late into the nights, piecing together a web of evidence that grew more disturbing with each discovery. Valerie's press credentials gave them access to shipping manifests and veterinary supply records that painted a dark picture. "Look at these orders," Valerie said one evening, spreading papers across Daryl's workbench. "Ketamine, steroids, antibiotics, all purchased through shell companies. No legitimate breeder needs these quantities." Daryl nodded, studying the documents. "And here's something else." He pulled out a crumpled paper he'd retrieved from Finch's dumpster. Fight schedules, coded but clear enough. Dates, locations, betting odds. They worked methodically, photographing everything. Valerie's police scanner crackled in the background while Rusty, growing stronger each day, dozed nearby. The puppy's presence reminded them constantly of what they were fighting for. Late one night, they spotted unusual activity at Finch's compound. Keeping to the shadows, they watched trucks arrive carrying injured dogs. Valerie's camera clicked silently, capturing license plates and faces. But they weren't as invisible as they thought. The next morning, Daryl found fresh tire tracks behind his shop. Someone had been watching them, too. Valerie insisted on installing security cameras, but they both knew it might not be enough. "We're close to something big," she said, reviewing their evidence. "These shipment records show dogs moving across state lines. That makes it federal." Daryl was about to respond when his phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Last warning." They doubled their efforts, knowing time was running out. Valerie contacted her sources at the Gaming Commission while Daryl documented more suspicious deliveries. Rusty stayed at the clinic for safety, though Daryl visited him daily. The attack came 3 nights later. Daryl woke to the acrid smell of smoke. Flames already engulfed the front of his shop, which doubled as his home. The heat was intense, and thick black smoke filled the air. He scrambled out of bed, coughing. Then he heard it, a frightened yelp from the workshop. His heart stopped. Rusty. He'd brought the puppy home just that evening, thinking he was finally strong enough. "Rusty!" Daryl shouted, but only crackling flames answered. The smoke was blinding now. He dropped to his hands and knees, crawling toward the workshop. The heat pressed against him like a physical wall. Somewhere, a window exploded from the pressure. The workshop door was hot to the touch. Daryl wrapped his shirt around his hand and yanked it open. Flames raced across the ceiling, and tools crashed down around him. Through the chaos, he heard another whimper, weaker this time. Rusty was huddled under a workbench, trembling. When he saw Daryl, his tail wagged once, but fear kept him frozen in place. "Come here, boy," Daryl called hoarsely. "Come on!" The puppy wouldn't move. Daryl cursed and crawled forward as burning debris rained down. The smoke was so thick he could barely see, but he kept moving. A falling beam grazed his shoulder, sending sparks flying. Finally, he reached the workbench. Rusty was pressed against the wall, eyes wide with terror. Daryl grabbed him, tucking the puppy inside his shirt. "I've got you," he whispered. "I've got you this time." The return journey was worse. The fire had spread, cutting off their main exit. Daryl's lungs burned, and Rusty whimpered against his chest. Through watering eyes, he spotted a faint rectangle of light, the side door. Gathering his remaining strength, Daryl surged forward. Something hot and heavy struck his back, but he kept moving. 3 more steps. 2. 1. They burst into the cool night air as the roof began to collapse. Daryl stumbled away from the building, still clutching Rusty. He fell to his knees in the gravel, gasping for breath. Sirens wailed in the distance. Rusty squirmed free of Daryl's shirt, licking his face frantically. Despite the pain in his back and lungs, Daryl managed a weak smile. They were alive. Tires crunched on gravel, and headlights swept across them. Daryl tensed, but it was Valerie's Honda. She jumped out, phone in hand. "I heard it on the scanner," she said, helping him up. "Are you okay? Is Rusty—" "We're both alive," Daryl wheezed. "But this was Finch. He knows we're close." Valerie's face hardened as she watched the shop burn. "Then we hit back harder. I've got everything backed up, all the evidence. This just gave us more proof of what we're dealing with." Daryl nodded, holding Rusty close as fire trucks arrived. The puppy's heart was racing, but he was unhurt. Looking at the burning building, Daryl felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about standing up to bullies who thought they could hurt the innocent without consequences. "We end this," he said quietly. "Now." Valerie squeezed his shoulder. "Together." As paramedics approached to treat his burns, Daryl watched his shop collapse in flames. But unlike the frightened boy who once walked away from injustice, he wasn't backing down. This time, he had something worth fighting for, and someone watching his back. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors. Daryl sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his bandaged hands. The burns weren't severe, but they hurt enough to remind him of everything he'd lost. His shop, his home, his tools. 20 years of building a life, gone in one night. Rusty lay curled at his feet, refusing to leave despite the nurse's protests. The puppy's loyalty only made the weight in Daryl's chest heavier. He'd saved one dog, but at what cost? "I should have known better," he muttered, wincing as he shifted position. "Getting involved only brings trouble." "That's exactly what they want you to think," Valerie said from the doorway. She walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, though Daryl couldn't hold his yet. "They burn you down, hoping you'll stay down." Daryl shook his head. "My whole life was in that shop. Everything I built after prison. Now I've got nothing again." "You've got me," Valerie said firmly, "and you've got proof of their crimes. That's not nothing." But Daryl was sinking into darker thoughts. Maybe this is what I deserve, trying to play hero when I'm just... Stop right there. Valerie set the coffee down hard enough to splash. I've spent weeks digging into your past, Daryl. You know what I found? A 20-year-old kid who made one terrible mistake and spent the next 2 decades trying to make up for it. That's not who you are anymore. The cops still see me that way. The whole town does. Then prove them wrong. Valerie pulled out her laptop. Look at what we've gathered. Supply records, fight schedules, witness statements, photos of injured dogs. We have everything we need to expose this operation. Daryl stared at the screen, seeing the evidence they'd collected. Each document represented a piece of the truth they'd fought to uncover. They'll just bury it locally. They always do. A smile crossed Valerie's face. That's why we're not going local. I still have contacts at major networks, journalists who owe me favors. People who can't be bought off or scared away. You'd risk your career again? Daryl asked. After what happened last time? Some stories are worth the risk. She met his eyes. But I need you with me on this. These people hurt Rusty. They've hurt countless other dogs. They tried to kill you both. Are you really going to let them win? Rusty lifted his head at the sound of his name, tail wagging hopefully. Looking at the puppy's trusting face, Daryl felt something shift inside him. The fear and doubt were still there, but underneath was a stronger feeling, determination. No, he said quietly. No, I'm not. Over the next few days, while his burns healed, they worked from Valerie's apartment. Daryl used his good hand to sort through their evidence, organizing everything into a clear narrative. Valerie made calls to her old contacts, carefully laying the groundwork. We need to move fast, she said one evening, before they can cover their tracks or threaten more people. Daryl nodded, watching Rusty sleep peacefully nearby. Do it. Send everything. Valerie's fingers flew across the keyboard, uploading documents and sending encrypted files to trusted journalists across the country. Now we wait, she said, hitting the final send button. The response came faster than either expected. Within 48 hours, the story broke nationally. Major news networks picked up Valerie's expose, running shocking footage of the fighting rings and detailed evidence of corruption. Federal authorities, unable to ignore the public outcry, launched an official investigation. Daryl watched the coverage from Valerie's couch, his bandaged hands gentle on Rusty's fur. The puppy had grown stronger, just like their case against Finch and his operation. They're calling it one of the largest dogfighting busts in state history, Valerie said, reading from her phone. Federal agents are serving warrants right now. Through her window, they could see police lights flashing in the distance. Somewhere out there, justice was finally catching up to Wallace Finch. You did this, Valerie said softly. You could have walked away that night you found Rusty, but you didn't. Everything that's happening now started with that choice. Daryl looked down at the sleeping puppy, remembering the frightened, dying animal he'd found in that ditch. We did this, he corrected. I couldn't have done it alone. Neither could I. Valerie sat beside him, watching the news coverage continue. Sometimes the right partner makes all the difference. Outside, more sirens wailed as federal agents moved through town. But inside, there was only peaceful silence as a man, a woman, and a rescued puppy sat together, watching justice unfold. The road ahead would still be challenging, but Daryl knew now that he didn't have to walk it alone. The full moon cast long shadows across Finch's sprawling compound as unmarked federal vehicles gathered silently along the surrounding roads. Daryl and Valerie waited in her car, parked behind the command post van where agents were finalizing the raid plan. You don't have to be here, Valerie whispered, her hand gripping her press badge. This isn't your fight anymore. Jess is in there somewhere, Daryl said, his eyes fixed on the distant buildings. She tried to help us. I'm not leaving her behind. Agent Roberts, the raid commander, approached their window. Remember, you two stay back until we clear the buildings. No heroics. Darryl nodded, but his jaw was set. The memory of Jess's frightened face when she'd warned him about Finch haunted him. She'd disappeared the next day, and he knew, they all knew, where she'd been taken. At exactly 11:30, the command came through. Execute, execute, execute. The night exploded into action. Federal agents swarmed the compound from all sides, their tactical lights cutting through the darkness. Federal agents, search warrant! The shouts echoed across the property. Gunfire erupted from the main house. The sharp crack of rifles split the air as Finch's men opened fire on the advancing agents. Darryl and Valerie crouched lower in their cars, bullets whizzed overhead. The back barn, Darryl said suddenly, pointing to a shadowy structure away from the main firefight. That's where they kept the dogs. Jess would know too much. They'd keep her close to make sure she stayed quiet. Valerie grabbed his arm. Darryl, we can't... But he was already moving, staying low and using the chaos as cover. Valerie cursed under her breath and followed him, her heart pounding. They reached the barn's side door unseen. Inside, they could hear dogs barking frantically. Darryl tested the handle, locked. He grabbed a fallen piece of pipe and smashed the lock, the sound lost in the ongoing gunfight. The smell hit them first, blood and fear and despair. Cages lined the walls filled with scarred and wounded dogs. And there, huddled in a corner cage, was Jess. "Oh, God," Valerie breathed. The young woman was alive but barely responsive, her eyes glazed and distant. Bruises marked her face and arms. Darryl wrenched her cage door open while Valerie kept watch. "Jess, it's Darryl. We're getting you out of here." She blinked slowly, recognition dawning. "You came back?" "I promised I'd protect you," he said, helping her stand on shaky legs. "I'm sorry I was late." Suddenly, orange light flickered through the barn's high windows. Smoke began seeping under the doors. Someone had set the building on fire. "We need to move," Valerie shouted. "Now!" Darryl half-carried Jess toward the exit as flames began climbing the wooden walls. The heat was intense, and smoke filled their lungs. Behind them, the trapped dogs howled in terror. "The dogs," Jess mumbled weakly. "Please." Darryl looked back at the cages, his heart breaking. But the fire was spreading too fast. They barely made it outside before the roof began collapsing. Federal agents spotted them and rushed forward with blankets and oxygen. As medics took charge of Jess, Darryl and Valerie watched the barn burn, the screams of the trapped animals haunting the night air. A commotion near the main house drew their attention. Agents were leading out Wallace Finch in handcuffs, his expensive clothes torn and dirty. His calm facade had cracked completely. "You have nothing!" he screamed, struggling against the restraints. "No proof! You can't touch me!" Valerie stepped forward, holding up a flash drive. "Actually, we have everything. Every document, every video, every witness statement. Your empire is finished, Finch." His face contorted with rage. "You're nothing but a washed-up reporter and an ex-con. Nobody will believe you." "The evidence speaks for itself," Agent Roberts said, producing a warrant. "We've been building this case for weeks thanks to their information. You're done." As agents led Finch toward a waiting vehicle, Darryl walked over to where Jess was being treated. She looked small and fragile on the stretcher, but her eyes were clearer now. "Thank you," she whispered, gripping his hand. I knew you'd come." Darryl squeezed her hand gently. "You're safe now. He can't hurt anyone else." Behind them, the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. The night sky glowed orange, reflecting off the dozens of emergency vehicles now surrounding the compound. Federal agents continued securing the scene, leading out more arrested suspects and gathering evidence. Valerie joined them, her face streaked with soot. "The story's already breaking. Every major network will have this by morning." They watched as Finch was driven away, his angry shouts fading into the night. The man who had seemed untouchable just hours ago was now just another criminal headed for justice. His reign of cruelty was finally over. In the days following the raid, Wallace Finch's carefully constructed world fell apart piece by piece. Local news stations ran constant coverage of the scandal, and more people stepped forward each day with their own stories of intimidation and abuse. Daryl watched it unfold from the comfort of his temporary apartment above Jerry's hardware store. His own shop was still a burnt-out shell, but insurance would cover the rebuilding. Rusty lay curled up beside him on the worn couch, his wounds healing nicely. The puppy's nightmares were becoming less frequent, just like Daryl's own. A knock at the door made Rusty's ears perk up. "It's open," Daryl called out. Valerie entered, holding up a thick manila envelope. "Just got this from my old editor in Chicago. They want me back. Full reinstatement, better salary, complete creative control." She tossed the envelope onto his coffee table without opening it. "Isn't that what you wanted?" Daryl asked, studying her face. "Your career back?" She sat down next to him, reaching over to scratch Rusty's ears. "I thought it was, but you know what? Breaking this story reminded me why I became a journalist in the first place. It wasn't about the prestige or the bylines. It was about making a difference." "So what are you saying?" "I'm staying," she said simply. "This town needs someone to keep telling the truth. Besides ... She smiled, glancing at him. "I've got some pretty good sources here now." Daryl felt something warm settle in his chest. He'd gotten used to having her around, even if he wasn't ready to admit how much that meant. The local diner became their unofficial meeting place as more developments unfolded. Each morning brought new revelations about Finch's operation. Bank records showed payoffs to local officials. Former employees came forward with horrifying details about the dogfights. The conspiracy of silence that had protected him for so long was crumbling. One morning, Jess joined them for breakfast. The bruises on her face had faded, but she carried herself with new strength. She'd been staying with her aunt in the next county over, recovering and helping federal prosecutors build their case. 6 more people came forward yesterday, she told them, stirring her coffee. Former handlers, mostly. They're all willing to testify about what they saw. "How are you holding up?" Daryl asked. "Better," she said. "The nightmares aren't as bad now. Knowing he can't hurt anyone else, it helps." She reached down to pet Rusty, who had become a regular fixture at their meetings. "The therapist says having a purpose makes healing easier. That's why I decided to volunteer at the animal shelter." Valerie smiled. "They're lucky to have you, someone who really understands what these animals have been through." The town itself was going through its own healing process. People who had looked the other way for years now spoke openly about their suspicions. The corrupt officials who had protected Finch were being removed one by one. Even the weather seemed to reflect the change, as spring brought new growth to cover winter's scars. Daryl's auto shop was slowly taking shape again. Local contractors offered their services at cost, and customers started returning. Many brought stories of their own encounters with Finch's operation, as if unburdening themselves of long-held secrets. One quiet evening, as Daryl worked late on rebuilding his garage, Sheriff Martinez pulled up in his patrol car. He was one of the few local law enforcement officers who hadn't been implicated in Finch's schemes. "Thought you might want to know," Martinez said, leaning against his car. "Federal prosecutor called today. Finch took a plea deal. 25 years, no possibility of early release. His assets will be seized and used to set up a fund for animal welfare programs." Daryl nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Good." "You did this town a service," Martinez continued. "Even if some folks took their time admitting it, we needed someone willing to stand up and do the right thing." "I had help," Daryl said, thinking of Valerie's determination and Jess's courage. "Yeah, you did." The sheriff smiled. "That's usually how the best changes happen. Not alone, but together." Later that night, Daryl sat on his temporary porch with Rusty at his feet. The puppy had grown stronger, his coat shiny and full where it had once been matted and bloody. He still favored his injured leg sometimes, but the vet said he would make a full recovery. Valerie joined him, bringing 2 cups of coffee. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out. The peace Daryl felt wasn't just about Finch's downfall or justice being served. It was deeper than that. For the first time since his troubled youth, he felt like he belonged somewhere. He had faced violence and corruption, not with more violence, but with persistence and truth. He hadn't walked away this time, and that made all the difference. Summer brought new life to the empty lot where Daryl's auto shop had once stood. Instead of oil stains and tire marks, fresh grass sprouted between carefully laid pathways. Where tool chests had lined the walls, comfortable kennels now stood in neat rows. The sign above the entrance read, "Second Chance Shelter," in simple blue letters. Daryl stood in the doorway of the main building, watching as Rusty romped through the grass with 2 other rescued dogs. The German Shepherd's coat gleamed in the sunlight, though a few scars still showed through, badges of survival that matched Daryl's own burn marks from the fire. "Got the last of the paperwork filed," Valerie called out, walking up with a stack of documents. "We're officially a registered nonprofit organization." She smiled, watching Rusty play. "Hard to believe that's the same dog we found in the ditch 6 months ago." "He's come a long way," Daryl said softly. "We both have." The shelter had started as a simple idea, converting his insurance money and the remains of his property into something meaningful. Word spread quietly through the community, and soon anonymous donations began appearing. Some were small, bags of dog food left on the doorstep, secondhand blankets, old leashes. Others were more substantial. Checks slipped under the door with notes saying things like, "Should have spoken up sooner," and "Making it right." Inside, the main room had been transformed into a warm, welcoming space. Photos of successfully adopted dogs lined one wall, while the other displayed information about responsible pet ownership and animal welfare. The whole place smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Jess arrived for her regular volunteer shift, carrying a box of supplies. She spent most afternoons at the shelter now, working with the more traumatized animals. Her gentle patience and first-hand understanding of their fear made her invaluable in their rehabilitation. "Mrs. Henderson called," she announced, setting down the box. "She wants to donate her late husband's carpentry tools. Says maybe we can use them to build more kennels." Daryl nodded. "Tell her we're grateful." He'd learned to accept help gracefully, understanding now that it wasn't just about him or even the dogs. The shelter had become a way for the whole community to heal, to make amends for years of looking the other way. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they went about their daily routines. Valerie organized adoption papers while Jess prepared meals for their current residents. Daryl walked through the kennels, checking on each dog, speaking softly to the more nervous ones. Every cage was spacious and clean, with comfortable beds and toys, the opposite of what he'd seen at Finch's compound. "Remember when you said this place would never work?" Valerie teased, joining him on his rounds. "That no one would want to help?" "I was wrong about a lot of things," Daryl admitted. "Thought I had to do everything alone. Thought the past was all there was." They paused at the back door, where Rusty was now lounging in a patch of sunlight. The dog lifted his head, thumping his tail against the ground in greeting. His eyes, once dull with pain and fear, now shone with contentment. Daryl knelt beside him, running a hand through his thick fur. The simple act brought back vivid memories of that night on the road. The weak whimper that had caught his attention, the trembling body in his arms, the desperate race to the vet clinic. He remembered his own trembling hands, the weight of past failures pressing down on him, and the moment he decided this time would be different. "You know," he said quietly, more to himself than to Valerie, "I always thought I was the one who saved him. But looking back, I'm not so sure anymore." Valerie sat down beside them. "How do you mean?" "That night finding him, it gave me a purpose again, a reason to stop hiding from the world." Daryl scratched behind Rusty's ears, earning a contented sigh from the dog. He needed someone to fight for him, and somehow that made me remember how to fight for myself too. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, casting a warm glow over the shelter grounds. In the distance, They could hear the happy barks of playing dogs and Jess's gentle voice as she worked with a newly arrived rescue. The peaceful scene was worlds away from the violence and corruption they'd faced down together. Rusty rolled over, offering his belly for scratches, a gesture of complete trust that still amazed Daryl every time. This was the same dog who had once flinched at every movement, who had woken crying from nightmares just like his own. Now here they both were, scarred but healing, helping others find their way back to trust and hope. "You're both second chances personified," Valerie observed softly, watching them together. "That's what makes this place special. Everyone here knows what it means to need one and what it means to give one." Daryl nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. Every day, the shelter reminded him that redemption wasn't just about making up for past failures. It was about choosing, again and again, to be present for those who needed you. It was about transforming pain into purpose, fear into courage, and silence into action. Thank you for watching. If even one moment stayed with you, don't forget to subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow with another story that speaks to the heart.